Good afternoon. My name is Marco Vargas. I'm a special agent with the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, Office of Inspector General. So we'll shorten that down to HUD OIG. So as a special agent with HUD OIG, we are HUD's watchdog. And like the presentation says, we're in charge of watching out for fraud, waste, and abuse within HUD's programs. That's me. I'm sure that's for the people online. All right, so we'll just briefly go over what HUD OIG's mission and purpose is. And to tell you a little bit more about me, I'm here out of the Chicago field office, which is part of the Midwest region. I've been a special agent with HUD for nearly 20 years. And during that 20 years, I've investigated a wide breadth of investigations, but I have not investigated disaster-related cases. We really haven't had much to say in disasters here in the Chicago area, like we have on the coasts or in the Gulf or up in New York and the Northeast for Superstorm Sandy. But that being said, investigations are investigations, and there are some common frauds and schemes and themes that are consistent throughout different types of cases. So HUD OIG conducts independent audits, evaluations, investigations, and other reviews to safeguard HUD's programs for fraud, waste, and abuse, like I already said. We have oversight responsibilities to include making timely recommendations to improve the economy and efficiency of HUD programs and operations. And the Inspector General reports directly to both the Department Secretary and Congress about the efficiency and effectiveness of HUD's programs and operations. The IG does have independence, though, which is important, right? Because the IG has the broad authority to make such reports that are in the sole judgment necessary or desirable. No HUD official may prevent the OIG from initiating or carrying out oversight or from issuing a subpoena. So as the OIG, we have what's deemed as a IG subpoena that allows us to conduct our investigations or audits or evaluations, and those come from our legal counsel within the OIG. If we're conducting a criminal investigation, a special agent like myself may also have grand jury subpoena authority, which would be issued from the Department of Justice. So it's just kind of depending which subpoena avenue we want to use, or maybe the case has yet to be accepted by Department of Justice. So we have the authority to utilize an IG subpoena to gather more documents and evidence to see if the case is going to rise to a level where it needs to be criminally prosecuted. The IG Act, which was in 1978, creates a dual reporting requirement to HUD and Congress. And the OIG independently exercises key authorities such as our own budget, our own personnel. And it's important that we stay kind of separate from HUD, because we may be called in to investigate HUD itself or HUD employees or HUD programs. So even though we're kind of underneath HUD, we're truly independent and we get our own budget appropriated from Congress. Here's our organizational chart. So the Inspector General is who leads our agency. It is currently Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis. The Inspector General is appointed by the President and then confirmed by Congress. Underneath is the Deputy Inspector General, and then you'll see our 6 departments. I am from the Office of Investigation. So predominantly, we are sworn law enforcement officers. We do have some support personnel and some forensic auditors that are assigned to us, but we are the law enforcement part of OIG. There's also the audit, that might do the audits of different HUD programs or on-site audits of grantees or housing authorities or other things. And each of us have our own area of responsibilities and expertise. So these are some of the types overall of OIG investigations, right? So we'll talk about some of these more in depth as we get into some of the later slides. But going back to the mortgage crisis of 2007 and 2008, that was a lot of our bread and butter for a little while. But we only investigate FHA insured loans. We don't really get into the conventional side of it. because there needs to be a HUD nexus for our investigations. We need to have some sort of HUD dollars present in order for the Office of Investigations to have some sort of jurisdiction to look into a potential crime. We have equity skimming, which could either be from single family or multifamily, landlord tenant fraud, which could be public housing or multifamily housing or housing choice voucher, commonly referred to as Section 8. And then bribery cases. There's a whole litany of different things that we investigate. So now we'll get into disaster fraud awareness. It can take many forms, right? It involves deception through the misrepresentation or omission of material facts for the purpose of illegitimate gain. And due to finite resources, it deprives citizens with legitimate needs from government benefits designed to support them after catastrophic events. So to boil that down, what I like to say is if someone, is getting funds illegitimately or ill-begotten, it's depriving someone else who could legitimately be utilizing these funds, right? After a disaster, Congress appropriates a certain amount of money for the disaster recovery. And if a portion of this money is going to people that don't legitimately need it, it's then depriving a citizen that does legitimately need it, right? And ultimately, it's all taxpayer money, and we should be good wards of taxpayer money. And that is, part of OIG's mission for our stakeholders to, seek out the fraud, waste, and abuse within HUD's programs. These are some potential fraud schemes: bribery, kickbacks, bid rigging, conflicts of interest, billing schemes, the formation of a new company to conceal previous violations. So what we mean by that is maybe an individual had previously been debarred by HUD to perform work. So they'll just form a new company with a new company head or a new company name to kind of circumvent their debarment. Small business or disability, minority, women, service disabled, veteran owned front. We'll get into that a little bit more. So we'll touch upon a few of these as we continue through the slideshow. Kickbacks. A kickback is a type of a bribe. A kickback is a collusive agreement where a cut of the profit is given to the bribe taker for services rendered. Kickbacks can be in the form of money, credit, gifts, gratuity, offering of services, or anything of value. So I think it's important too to kind of get it out of your minds. That's not always cash. It's not always money. It can be anything of value. It can be a gift. It could be an expensive trip. It could be a service. I've seen instances in other cases that I've worked where someone was awarded a contract and they perform work on that individual's house for free that awarded said contract. So they got something of value, but it wasn't necessarily like, hey, I got this $50,000 contract, I'm going to kick you back $5,000. It's more along the lines like, well, I'm going to come do this for you because you awarded me this contract. A common kickback scenario that occurs is when a prime contractor instructs the subcontractor to inflate the cost of materials. An inflated false invoice is submitted. An employee at the prime contractor ensues payment is made on the false invoice. And then when they receive payment for the materials, they'll kick a portion of that money back to the subcontractor. So they're kind of, colluding together so that they can inflate costs to reap a larger benefit in which they then share. A red flag to payments coded as fees for consulting or other services should be scrutinized. Two big things are, right, labor and materials. So if you're looking at the cost of materials and you're looking at the cost of labor, you should be able to see those on the bills submitted versus just something that's claimed as a fee, especially if the fees are large. That'd be something you want to question. Well, what does this fee entail? Why are you charging this fee? Is this a one-time fee? Is this going to be a continuation of a fee? Bid rigging is a fraud that involves the impeding of competitive bidding. Generally, bid rigging involves an agreement to limit competition, and these schemes occur in the pre-solicitation, solicitation, or the evaluation phase of the bidding process. So there's some red flags, right? You can read these. I'll just touch upon a couple of them. Projects split into smaller award amounts to avoid review. I've come across this in housing authorities. They have the authority to do a no bid contract if it's under a certain dollar amount. And if it reaches a certain threshold, then they have to do the full solicitation of bids. So they might structure the bids as and divide them up into, say, like 3 bids. That way they don't have to go through the whole bidding process, right? So they're circumventing the checks and balances that are in place. So we want to watch out for that. In the solicitation phase, the falsification of contractor qualifications, work history, or personnel. Some of the things I've come across is for like asbestos removal or lead remediation. There's been contractors that indicate that they have these required certifications when in fact they do not. So they're not qualified to remove asbestos or remediate lead, but yet they were awarded a contract to do so. Is that because they falsified their bid package, or is that because someone kind of, steered that bid to their certain company because they have a financial gain, out of them winning? Bid submission or contract acceptance. A bidder who always bids last on the contracts and consistently wins. Are they coming in late or towards the end and always winning? And maybe some of them is getting some of them like inside information, right? Revealing some of what the other contractors have put in their bids. So that way this person coming in at the last minute has some more knowledge that the other individuals would not. Conflict of interest occurs when an employee, manager, executive has an undisclosed economic or personal interest in a transaction that adversely affects the person's employer. A criminal conflict occurs when an employee participates substantially in a particular matter where he or she has a financial interest if the particular matter will have a direct and predictable effect on the interest. So this just lists some conflicts of interest. A lot of times too, in my experience, it's been that they have an economic interest in a particular company, whether it's a family member, sometimes even an undisclosed spouse owns the company, or a brother, a sister, a cousin, a friend. So they want to steer the work towards that particular company. And then maybe even with the conflict of interest, they get some sort of kickback. Or, if one of their family members or their spouse owns the company, then they have financial incentive to steer business to a particular business or entity. Some red flags: increase of business with one contractor or subcontractor, right? If one person seems to be consistently winning each and every time, are they in fact the business being steered that way, or are they the best bidder? Change orders a lot of times with a high percentage of original costs, meaning after they said, labor and materials are going to cost a certain amount of money, they subsequently come back with a change order to increase materials or labor. We touched upon this one earlier. Really what happens is a small business, minority, women-owned, or disabled veteran, they might get preferential treatment to get contracts. So they'll be used as a front. So there could be a woman or another individual that's put forward as the business owner when in fact they are not. It's another owner kind of behind the scenes. So they're just using them as a front or a straw. So that way they can get business that they wouldn't otherwise be awarded. Fraud deterrence. Right. So we're going to ask you guys, this is what we're kind of looking for as we do investigations, right? The strength of your forms. 18 USC 1001. This is like an investigator's best friend. It's just false statements, right? So if they've made, an individual's made a false statement to the government, you can read, the 1, 2, and 3, what the kind of the takeaways are and what they need to do. False statements too, like I know it's kind of dated, but going back, Martha Stewart for insider training, she actually was convicted of false statements and obstruction of justice. What her false statements was lying to investigators. So if OIG or other federal investigators come to question an individual and they make material misrepresentations and lie to us, that is a crime in and amongst itself. So we love false statements. It's an easy way to make a case. It's an easy way for you guys to strengthen your forms, which I'll give you 2 examples on the next slide. So like with the first one is if you're going to have a contract, you can put this disclaimer up, right? This would be more for like a wet signature if they're actually going to sign the contract. So they can read this. Even if they don't read it, it's on the form because you should be reading a form that you're signing, correct? And then below would be more if you're using like DocuSign or some other thing online where you can put the same warning, but make sure that they have to check that they've read the statement before they can advance. So at least you have, you know, an outright action, an outright affirmative action that, yes, I have read this warning and disclaimer, and I'm choosing to move forward. 18 U.S.A. 287 is false claims. So it's just a little bit different than false statements, but it's still good and still usable for us. And then 31 U.S.C. 3729 is the civil code of false statements. So 18 is the criminal code, and then 31 is for civil violations. You should develop an anti-fraud policy, right? Kind of define what fraud is, list examples of offenses that are prohibited. I won't read all those, but you can go through or create some of your own. Require employees and contractors to report suspected fraud, right? The old see something, say something. A majority of the cases that I get is from a call from someone that knows our office, maybe knows me personally, or to our hotline, right? Concerned citizens will say, you know, this individual is constantly winning bids and I don't understand why. Or a concerned person at, you know, a grantee's office will call and say, look, we're getting these change orders. I don't understand why these material costs are getting so high. So we can open up a complaint based on an allegation, or if it's already seems to be substantiated, we'll open up an investigation and look into the matter. Know the rules and regulations, right? You guys have already had 2 days full of interesting topics where you're learning things. We're the ones that come in when things don't go well, right? We're usually reactive, not proactive. Something happens, there's a problem. You guys determine maybe there's some sort of fraud, then we come in to look at it. Communicate with HUD. I communicate with HUD all the time. We're supposed to be, OIG is supposed to be looking at fraud, waste, of use against all the HUD programs. I am not an expert by any means of any or all the HUD programs. So I have to use HUD as a resource myself. When an investigation comes in for a program that I'm not familiar with, one of the first things I do is start looking in the HUD handbook, looking up a HUD employee, calling them and saying, hey, can you explain this to me? Because this just came across my desk and we might have a problem. Get training. You're obviously doing that this week. It's great. You know, learn more. Prevention. Keep good documentation, because when we do come in and start an investigation, we're going to say, well, show us. How do you know this? Why do you know this? And how can we prove this, right? Just because you say so isn't really good enough for us to work a good criminal investigation. We're going to need those forms that are signed. We're going to need you to show us the rules and regulations that this individual didn't abide by. And good internal control structure. So this is kind of what I'll say what we like, meaning investigations, right? I'm a criminal investigator. I like to work criminal cases. Sometimes we do work civil cases, or sometimes we do administrative actions as well. But this could kind of paint a picture of what has happened and then the outcomes of our cases, right? We want to punish people that have done wrong, whether that's with fines, whether that's with them going to prison, whether that's with restitution. We're out there to try to get criminals. So there's our enforcement actions. We can do a criminal case, a civil case, an administrative case. Sometimes we do all 3 together. It could be a civil and a criminal case. They'll kind of work parallel, sometimes just criminal, sometimes just civil. So here's a case out of Staten Island of New York after Hurricane Sandy. There were a husband and wife and they made a misrepresentation that a home on Staten Island that was severely damaged was their primary residence. It was not their primary residence. It was proven that 7 months before the storm hit, they chose to move to a different area of New York City for whatever reason. They still owned the home at the time that the Hurricane Sandy hit, and they ultimately applied for and received funds from 3 different agencies: HUD, FEMA, and the third one I forget was who it was with. They applied for. They said the new address that they were living at was a result of their home being destroyed, so they got rental assistance to live in the new place that they had previously moved to on their own accord prior to the storm. The husband ended up fleeing. He left the country and went to Egypt, and he has never returned to the U.S. to our knowledge. So there's still an active warrant for him. The wife decided to enter a plea agreement, and she got 3 years probation and had to pay a large restitution to the 3 agencies in which they had fraudulently got the money from. Another husband and wife in New Jersey. They reside in Dumont, but they had a property in Seaside Heights, which was severely damaged by Sandy. So what do they say? They say that was our primary address. So that way they can get assistance to rebuild their vacation home. It is proven that they didn't. They decided to go to trial, and the jury found in favor of the government and convicted both the husband and wife. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She got community service, I believe 5 years of probation, and they had a large restitution amount that they have to repay. Another husband and wife team from Superstorm Sandy. This one's a little bit different. Jeffrey was a contractor, so he received a lot of funds from Hurricane Sandy recipients. So what he was in charge of doing, he was going to come out and repair their homes. In many instances, he was going to raise or elevate the homes, so that way when there was, if there was a future storm, that the homes wouldn't be flooded out and get the similar damage again. But he ended up not doing the majority of the work. As the money came in, he didn't do the work. He didn't raise their homes, he didn't fix their homes, or he would do real substandard work, which was like these victims getting hit twice, right? They already had their homes damaged from the storm. The government steps in, it's going to help them with some disaster-related funds, yet this guy rips them off, doesn't complete the work, and now they're kind of back in square one. And he just squandered the money kind of on a lavish lifestyle. He was convicted. He got sentenced to 7 years in jail. Tracy Meadus, she received a small rental property program funds to repair a rental property. This program was about displaced residents from Katrina. So people that had been displaced, they were still redoing homes to allow these displaced residents to come back. Tracy was supposed to only charge a certain amount of rent because it was for lower income individuals, when in fact she charged a vastly higher rent than the program allowed. She even falsified tenant records. So for one individual, she signed a fraudulent lease. It was determined that this tenant was actually in prison at the time the lease was signed and never lived in this property. And she had someone else living there that was paying rent, way higher than they were supposed to be. She was sentenced to 12 months home confinement and 3 years supervised release and had to pay a restitution of $158,700. So a monitoring tip: bank statements. Structure your grantee agreements so that bank statements must be produced upon request. Unfortunately, I don't have any verbiage like I did for the false statements. I contacted a few people. I couldn't really find anyone that had any sort of language like this. So what I did do was on the bottom for the HUD resource library, it's a live link and you can click on that and it goes to the HUD exchange, but it goes to a certain area of the HUD exchange. It's not just the blanket. It's like for disaster recovery and then sub-grantees. And then you can get into 24 CFR 570.503. That's agreements with subrecipients. And that has a lot of good language of maybe how you can structure it so that way you can get some bank statements so you can monitor those. So this was a case I personally worked. It's not disaster recovery, but a lot, like I said before, a lot of the frauds and a lot of the schemes, they're kind of the same, right? There's kind of common themes and what's happening in one area may be happening in others. So this individual, her name was Michelle Slajan. She was the assistant executive director of the Hammond Housing Authority. HUD OIG was just doing a routine audit and was auditing the housing authority. And they found, by monitoring the bank statements, they found one payment that didn't make sense. It was from the rental account to Michelle Slajan's personal checking account. So then the question would be, well, how do they know that was her personal checking account? It was the same account in which her payroll was deposited. So they were confused as to why was she receiving this rental payment. So they brought it to my attention and we opened an investigation. Well, it turns out it was just one mistake. For whatever reason, whatever that day, she made a mistake when she entered the payments and put in her payroll account, when in fact she had numerous other bank accounts that she had controlled over an access of 3 years and siphoned off over $600,000 from the rental accounts. How could this be? How could this happen? Well, there were some red flags. People didn't say anything. They didn't know, but they knew something was wrong. Because a lot of times what we do when an investigation starts is we come in and we interview. We like to sit down and talk with people because people are the ones that have the knowledge, right? I don't know what's going on in a particular agency or a particular contractor or grantee, but all you guys do, and you guys can share your knowledge and information with us. So they said, well, we were curious because she lived vastly exceeding her income. Well, what do you mean? She had great cars. She had a boat. She had a lake house in Michigan. We were surprised she was able to afford all this based on her salary from the housing authority. Well, that's a red flag, right? Unless she has some other job or, has some other income source, how is she affording the lifestyle? She was also very protective of the accounts, meaning she didn't allow other people to check the accounts in which she was working in. She would tell them, you don't understand the way I do things. I have my way. Don't worry. I got it. Well, that becomes a problem, right? If you're not having checks and balances and one person is controlling an account, it might be a problem. So she also got hit on an IRS case too. A lot of times we'll bring IRS in. If you have ill-begotten funds, in theory, you're supposed to pay income tax on those ill-begotten funds, which obviously people do not. So she also had an IRS hit and owes the IRS over $200,000 for the over $600,000 that she embezzled from the housing authority. And she got sentenced to 3 years in prison besides the restitution to HUD and the IRS. This was another case I personally worked. Again, not disaster recovery, but it has similar themes. Ashley Dunlap was a contractor in East Chicago. He receives a contract from the Gary Housing Authority for a vacancy reduction program. All that is they have a number of public housing units that are vacant due to maintenance issues. So they want to bring those back online so they can fill them with tenants. So they make a bid solicitation. Dunlap puts in with his DNR construction company, and he wins. So written into the contract was that he needed to provide a surety bond or a performance bond. This way, if there was a problem with the work, that they have a way to reconcile that. Well, he doesn't want to do that for whatever reason. And instead, he asks if he can give, which was written in the contract that he could, he wanted to give a percentage of the contract award price in cash or in cashier's checks to be held in escrow in lieu of the performance bond. So the housing authority agrees. And this happens during the contract acceptance phase. So when they go to deposit these cashier's checks, lo and behold, they're fake. They're fraudulent checks. They bounce. So they call us. and we go in and investigate. And it turns out that he ultimately admits and goes into a plea agreement that he fraudulently printed the checks himself and created the checks because he alleged he was not able to afford the surety bond. Well, had he not fraudulently made these checks, he would not have been awarded the contract. And even though he was performing the work, he still had financial gain, right? He got a contract that he was not otherwise entitled to because he didn't hold up his end of the bargain. For credit cards, if you can structure your agreements so that credit card statements must be produced upon request, randomly pick a month, look how charges are allocated, look for charges that are unrelated to the agency mission, and ask for proof for unrelated charge are not being paid with grant funds. He was an employee down in Fort Myers at the Housing Authority. He utilized the Housing Authority credit card for expensive dinners, for tuition for some of his children, for trips all over the country that were unrelated to his housing authority, and for gifts to other individuals. Had someone monitored the credit card, they could have picked up on this, because as soon as OIG got the credit card statements and was able to look at them and see what these charges were for, it was obviously not housing authority related. Another interesting thing that he actually did was he had a friend who was a contractor. So he had his contractor friend create false invoices in which he would bill the housing authority for work that was never performed, get paid, and then kick the money back to Mr. Jackson. So not only did he misuse the credit card, he had a whole false invoice scheme going on as well. So there's like civil consequences of committing fraud. Like I said before, may be imposed in addition to criminal prosecutions. You might have a criminal case. We might also work a civil case, or sometimes a civil case doesn't make a good, or sometimes a good criminal case doesn't always make a good civil case, or vice versa, right? The standard for evidence in a civil case is lower. It's a preponderance of the evidence, whereas in a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance of the evidence just means more likely than not. Referring fraud, right? So don't hide the dirty laundry, clean it. What do we mean by that? So going back to the Dunlap case I had discussed, it was the Gary Housing Authority executive director that actually called me personally. I work a lot out in Northwest Indiana. That's where I do a lot of my outreach. I'll go around, talk with people, introduce myself, say what we do. So he called and said, hey, I think we have a problem. And I drove out there, looked at the checks, determined there was a problem, and we went from there, right? He could have tried to hide it, which would have just further exacerbated the problem. So if you come across something, it might be no wrongdoing on you or your program or your agency, right? It could be someone on the outside that did something. So the reaction to the occurrence of the fraud is what defines the management of the agency. Don't be afraid to report the fraud. We ask you, please report the fraud. The existence of your fraud policy and proper handling of the fraud itself is a deterrent to clients, vendors, and employees. So these cases that I've talked to you about, I talk about them in Northwest Indiana as well. That way people know, if they know that OIG is out there actually conducting criminal investigations, actually getting cases done, people are having to repay money, people are going to jail, then maybe that's a deterrence in and amongst itself. That's for someone that thought about committing a crime and then chose not to. Addressing the fraud assists with ridding the industry of bad apples. Addressing fraud to determine what procedures were violated allows management to close the gaps to ensure the same fraud will not reoccur. It's going back to like Hammond Housing Authority. They no longer have one individual who controls the accounts. There's 3 individuals that review the accounts. So that way, if something comes up, the other 2 or 1 would pick it up. What kinds of things should you report? Mismanagement, violation of laws, rules, or regulations, theft of and fraudulent claims for funds, the actions of a business partner or employee. We'll talk a little bit more about the hotline in a minute. Hotline complaints can be kept confidential upon request. Measures to assist OIG in successful investigations. Make sure the eligibility criteria are clearly defined. Incorporate signed certifications and fraud acknowledgments, as we discussed earlier. Utilize a checklist signed by recipients, case management employees documenting items covered in a meeting. Keep good notes. Some people I've talked with have excellent notes. They'll be like, I talked with so-and-so on Monday, and he or she said this, and this is the things we talked about. And this is when I first started the question, what their motives were. Record a method of submittal of documents. We like to know whether it was mail or email or fax, because it will help us in further into the scheme. We may charge mail fraud, which is where something in continuance of the scheme is put in the United States mail, or it could be UPS or FedEx and crosses state lines, or a wire fraud. Involve HUD OIG early at the first indication of fraud. So if you find something, contact us, right? Maybe we'll look at it or just open up a complaint and we'll say it doesn't meet merit for a full investigation, but at least that way we have a good pulse on what's happening. Cooperate with us. Don't require us to give an IG subpoena. If you find some fraud and we come in and say, can you give us the documentation that supports your claim, please just give it to us. Maintain your original documents. That's real important too, especially if you're doing, wet signature contracts or things of that nature. So that's me and my email. And then that's the two supervisors that are here in Chicago. And here is our hotline number. And if you go to hudoig.gov, there's also a way there that you could make a hotline complaint. I would encourage you guys to not do anonymous complaints if at all possible. And why is that? The first thing we do is when we get a complaint that come across our desk, we read who submitted the complaint, because we want to know how do they know this and what more can they tell us. So you might get a call from us. That'll be like our first step. It's great when someone leaves their name and their phone number, so that way we can call them and say, hey, you allege this is going on. Tell me why you think this is happening, and even better, tell me how you know this is happening. And then that way we can get the communication going. If you want to remain anonymous later, we can do that, but it's beneficial that you at least put in some sort of contact information, so that way it's not just an anonymous complaint from person X that has some information, and as soon as we read it, we're like, oh man, I have this question and that question, but now I have no one to contact to get further information. That's it. If we have any questions, gladly take those.
Thank you very much. If there are any questions, raise your hand and I'll come find you. We had a question in the chat that asked if there was a statute of limitation on fraud.
Yes. So it depends on what the way. So that's the way the attorney wants to try the case. So we work with the United States Attorney's Office, or we may work with a state prosecutor or a county. So for like a false statements, we'll just say it's 5 years. Like a wire fraud is 10 years. So just because someone makes a false statement, generally we could even go after it in a wire fraud charge, because ultimately, unless you're cutting paper checks to the individual for you're paying paying the contractor or paying the grantee or sub grantee, the money is generally wired. So if they're submitting a false statement that causes money to be wired, then we can go after them for wire fraud. So yes, there is statute of limitations, but it's different for each crime that is committed.
Could you speak a little bit more to the concept of waste, and when is something like everybody's doing this for the first time versus now this is wasteful and we've wasted a lot of money, right? That kind of idea of there's a lot of folks who are new to compliance.
Waste. I would say it's actually something we look at the least, to be honest with you, because it's tough to come up with a strategy to deem how to do a good criminal investigation on what is waste, like what is wasteful, versus like an actual fraud that's perpetrated. You can see maybe like I can compare it to like housing authorities or on wastefulness for unauthorized travel or use of vehicles that are for personal use. Like some agencies have vehicles, so it'd be considered wasteful to use it that way. But even though that I claim, and that's the name of my presentation, fraud, waste, and abuse, we don't look into specific waste so much as the fraud itself, if that makes sense.
Are there any instances where electronic signatures are not sufficient to support the applicant or other beneficiary committing fraud?
I have not run across that. Generally speaking, though, too, it's the Department of Justice or U.S. Attorney's Office that talks about that. But there's other avenues we can get to, like if it was in question of who actually, signed this electronically, IP addresses can be pulled, via subpoena, so that the IP address of the computer that comes back to Marco Vargas, contractor X, at a certain residence. So even if I'm saying I'm not the one that electronically signed it, well, then it's like, well, it's your laptop at your house with your internet provider. If it wasn't you, then please tell me who. And that would read, beyond a reasonable doubt in my mind.
Thank you. I'm just curious. So I know these are federal funds that are being sort of passed down through either a state or local entity. So if you were to prosecute against fraud, would it be at the state and federal level or just the federal level because they're federal funds? Or can you talk about that? And then, because I saw in some of your slides that some people served in state prisons. So just curious how that works with both the federal side and also the state side.
So it would only be one or the other. It would either be with state or local, like I said, county or federal. Ultimately, we like to take our cases federally first because it is federal money. So even the way that you explained it, we have to show how the money flows actually as we're working our criminal investigation. So ultimately, all the money comes to the United States Treasury, then to HUD, then whether it goes down to a certain state and then maybe to a county or municipality, but ultimately it's federal funds. So we have jurisdiction over it. Why sometimes cases are worked other ways is the way the information comes in too. Maybe, HUD OIG is not big. There's only a couple hundred trained investigators, and some people don't know about it, but they do know about their attorney general's office, right? So if you have a concerned citizen that goes into the attorney general's office and wants to make a complaint about some sort of fraud that's involving HUD funds, ultimately it works our way to us. And we're not going to, tell the attorney general's office they can't work this case. So we'll work it jointly with them in state. Also, federal prosecutors have a higher threshold for loss. So sometimes in a district, like here in Chicago, it's a big district. There's a lot going on, a lot of public corruption, right? A lot of other federal crimes that are going on. Sometimes HUD fraud isn't the greatest, has the greatest jury appeal to them. So then we'll take it to the state and they'll work it. So that's kind of different avenues of way we'll do it. I mean, I work cases here too, locally at 26th in California with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office too. And I've worked with Attorney General's office and I've worked with federal prosecutors as well. So sometimes if a case gets declined by the feds as well, I can take it to the Attorney General's office and it might make their criteria where it wasn't, good enough. I don't say good. It didn't meet the loss thresholds that federal prosecutors sometimes require.
And just reviewing questions that were submitted on Whova, there is some concern or questions around like best practices. I feel like you touched on that a lot throughout your presentation, and invite those to visit the slides that are on the HUD Exchange to review those over time. Is there any best practice that you want to just reiterate before we close out?
keep your documents in line, right? Because that's what we're going to come and ask for, your original documents, because that's what the prosecutor's office is going to want. They're going to want to know what the guidelines are, what they had to sign, and what you still have. So the better you maintain your records and the better you have them, the easier it is for us to work a case. Because I always say too, like, we don't get called to a fraud in progress, right? We're reactive. The fraud has generally already occurred, and then we come back in and kind of have to reconstruct what happens. Like, we don't come in and the fraud is happening right now.
Thanks for being a speaker with us tonight.
Thank you.
For those that are here on site in Chicago, the networking event starts here at 5 o'clock, so you have a little bit of time before that gets going. That is on the lobby floor, and it's in the Honoré Ballroom. And for our virtual attendees, we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.